So our next speaker is Stevie Barnett. She's majoring in cultural anthropology here at Ashford. She's also an Air Force veteran, and she works as a meteorologist. So I would say very broad background we have here. And Stevie, thank you so much for joining us, and take it away.
So I appreciate y'all for hearing me out and listening to me. I found the last presentation to be really informative. I would have loved to talk to her about her points. My presentation is about interpreting global interaction through the lens of the Joe Rogan Experience, which is a podcast on YouTube. And yeah, I was going to tell you a little bit about myself. Professor Peterson covered it pretty much. I came to Ashford after serving in the Air Force. I spent most of my time in Japan. The picture to the right is it's the top of Mount Fuji at 4 o'clock in the morning. And I realized while I was in Japan, my passion for anthropology and linguistics, so I'm trying to share that with you guys today. I believe anthropology to be the most scientific of the humanities, and so I'm aligning my presentation with scientific methods. A little different than our previous presenter. And as far as the purpose of it, when you are ascertaining your anthropological degree, you learn a lot about philosophy, actually, and one of the most prominent ones that dictates our research and the questions we ask is Hegel, who articulates on the dialectic materialism. And I personally believe it's an antiquated idea. However, it does begin to try to explore how the dynamics of technology influences human behavior and therefore affects the world. And when I had a casual relationship with the Joe Rogan podcast, like before I studied it, I came to realize that Joe Rogan, although he's a comedian, he alludes to these questions throughout his discussions, no matter who his guest is. He happens to think, based on current events, and these are my words, not his, that the world is on fire, right? So it led me to ask, are we in the Middle Ages of the internet, so to speak? And so to make that scientific, made a hypothesis, right? If we are in the Middle Ages, can we find evidence of that rhetorically in the podcast itself and within the comments? So a little bit about Joe Rogan, if you don't know who he is. He's born in New Jersey. He's been a comedian for 20 years, a podcaster for 9. I date his first YouTube podcast of the Joe Rogan Experience, his main podcast, in 2013. And he has over 30 sponsors, such as Cash App. He says that this does not influence his content at all. If it does, he gets rid of those sponsors. He makes a lot of money as a comedian. He doesn't need it. And we don't hear those ads on YouTube. So to conduct my experiment, I had to set a few parameters to focus my research. So I'm concerned about current events, so is Joe Rogan. So I focused on the 2018 podcast. That's 161 podcasts, averaging 2.5 hours each. And as far as the comments, I focused on the longer threaded exchanges. Usually they averaged about 100 hits per thread. And this is only because this is more likely where you're going to see the exploration of ideas on a global scale. And with my research, I actually got a lot of data, so I wanted to share some of that with you. 2% of the guests were females. It's a man's world, according to the 2018 podcasting of Joe Rogan. 63% came from his realm of expertise, meaning they were content creators, they were comedians, artists, YouTubers, certain types of entrepreneurs, and they come from the sports industry or athletic industry. They're teaching martial arts or whatever. 37% come from outside his realm, academics, practicing scientists, and government officials per se. And then within the 37%, I decided to shred it out to see, for ideas that he's not most informed with, how he may be approaching them guest-wise. And you can see here, as far as the politics and the scientific community, we have an equal distribution of guests who lean to whichever particular side. So you see that whether or not that was intentional or not, I don't know how he scheduled these things, but as far as the evidence suggests, there is a balanced display of positions within all the various topics. And so he actually becomes very informed about topics that he previously didn't know. as far as if we're in the Renaissance or the Middle Ages or not, this is a pretty Renaissance concept where he's striving for a vita contemplativa, which is excellent, like mental fortitude, mental excellence. And this is a Renaissance concept. And then as far as it being received, it's pretty well received. It's one of the most popular podcasts on the internet, 4.6 million subscribers on YouTube. The top 5 podcasts view-wise were from guests who are widely regarded as renegades in their respective career fields, right? Elon Musk pushing the envelope with tech, Neil deGrasse with astrophysics, making it accessible for regular people, trying to put it in our vernacular. That's a pretty Renaissance concept in itself. And then as far as the worldly interaction, global interaction, the lighter colors represent the guests and any commenters that identify with that country. Darker colors represented here are from the commenters that were not represented in the podcast. So this is a testament to the power of the internet and how it influences communication. Aside from Antarctica and only a little bit from Africa, you have a lot of communication across all the continents. It's happening relatively unfiltered, asynchronous, in a way that a scale that's unprecedented before. And it's really beautiful to see, although I'm going to tell you right now, the comments they were not as beautiful to witness. So, but in hindsight, it's pretty awesome. And it wouldn't be a science experiment without considering the uncertainties. So there were a lot of uncertainties, were pros and cons, where actually one particular concept of the uncertainty was kind of like a double-edged sword. I know that's a mouthful. So as far as the subjects go, nobody knew I was interviewing them, so then there was no Hawthorne effect. However, there are people on the internet who are highly aware of their presence and how it can affect others. So I'm calling those trolls. Like they're trying to get a reaction. They're not contributing to a conversation. They don't want to. They're just trying to make people upset, right? You have data collection, where I have a plethora of information. There were threads upon threads upon threads, relatively unfiltered, happening asynchronously. People would comment on something maybe 2 weeks ago where it was actually like the podcast is about a year old. So people were commenting from things today, right? Or for a podcast that was done in January. However, there was missing data or edited data. So, and that's because if somebody reports something on YouTube, it's a private company. If it doesn't conform to their code of conduct, they can delete it. And therefore, I'm chasing kind of a scent trail of how the interactions are going without knowing what incited that particular conversation, because that comment's missing now. So that was an uncertainty I couldn't control. And I had a worldly input, as you just saw. People were commenting from all over the world, but certain parts of the world more than others. So for instance, there might have been a discussion about the Trump administration and its foreign policy in Israel. Someone will comment identifying themselves as living in Egypt or being from Egypt. Well, I don't have another instance where somebody, or I can deduce that they're from that country. And so now you have the singular Egyptian playing ambassador, whether they're aware of it or not, to other people within the discussion. And so that is an uncertainty. Whereas if I'm considering comments from Australians and the UK or Americans, because Joe Rogan is American, it's pretty polyvocal and it's more informed that way. So there are a lot of linguistic aspects that lend themselves to the Middle Ages. I centered my research on the High Middle Ages, the last 300 years, right before you get into the Renaissance, because no matter where you were in the world at that time, there were certain overarching themes throughout that world. You had a political system tied to a belief system and a particular leadership or a family. And if you dissented, you were punished. You were explicitly punished. We see that in the podcast and in the comments. So, for instance, there's an idea war going on. Or in the podcast, they discuss the equality of outcome. For instance, with the transgender community, there's an issue with the ethics belonging to specifically transgender males participating in conventionally the sports assigned to biological females. Is that correct or not? Is that the right thing or not? And people who are dissenting are being called transphobic or they'll even be called Nazis. And they address that in the podcast. In the comments, they're actually redefining the word Nazi to try to attack left-leaning commenters. Or they don't know the etymology of the word Nazi. They don't know it pertains to a right-leaning early 20th century concept. And if you try to correct them, they tell you some pretty defamatory things. I don't want to get into it. They're pretty mean. I did participant observation. Let's just leave it at that. So there's public humiliation as well. Joe Rogan had Roseanne Barr on the podcast. Anybody following current events will know that she made a specific Twitter comment that was taken out of context and was swiftly removed from her own TV show without being investigated, without considering her history with mental illness. So you have that with comments. Public humiliation comes in the form of insults and in the form of the trolling, which I just got finished reading Deb Tannen's Argument Culture, and she talks about this agonistic perspective where it's no matter what it is, you're not trying to find an answer, you're just trying to argue with somebody, you're trying to get somebody upset, because that's really important. The most important thing was to just talk, not get an answer. And then you have the concept of witch hunts, where people are dissenting, it goes with the public humiliation, but they're singled out, and kind of the rest of their life is as they know it, it's terminated. So at least linguistically, we can see this where you're calling for people being sued for using the wrong words or not pertaining to a specific ideology. Joe Rogan had a fellow comedian, Tom Segura, on the podcast where he uses the word retard in his Netflix special, not to defame anybody who identifies or is associating with the physically abled. He was just interpreting the word comedically, and yet people are suing him. They're trying to get his Netflix special taken off without even watching it. He has a lot of legalization where he couldn't even talk about it all because it's still a process. And in the comments, you have people who are disagreeing, threatening to report others because they simply don't agree, or they'll cite violence against a stranger who may be anywhere in the world. So that was pretty medieval in itself. But it's not all doom and gloom. We did see some people using the technology in order to try to elevate themselves. So I had to cover the Renaissance as well as a contrast. In the Renaissance, you see mysticism, arete, and modernity. Mysticism means basically for the Renaissance, people were given autonomy. In the Renaissance, it used to be, or in the medieval times, it used to be that somebody tried to tell you how you could become closer to God. You had to look to somebody in the pointy hat in the corner of a room, right, swinging the incense around, telling you how you could be closer to God. But in the Renaissance, that power was given to the people. They could determine how they were going to be closer to God. And so I'm looking at the autonomy aspect of it, not the religious aspect. You have arete, where people are striving for excellence in their physical lives, the vita activa, and their mental lives, the vita contemplativa. And then you also have the striving for modernity, which is empirical reasoning, objectivity, and overall science. And so you see that in the podcast and the comments as well. As far as the power to the individual, Joe Rogan cites this in his pro-weed arguments. He believes all drugs should be legal and that no government should tell you what you put in your body. So he gives power to people that way, or tries to strive for that. In the comments, they empower strangers by trying to de-escalate situations where people are calling for violence. There's no need to call somebody names just because they don't agree with you. You need to chill out. You need to calm down. As far as arete goes, we can see that the vita contemplativa is, it's an ongoing thing with the podcast as far as exploring the topics. You can also see that they're exploring the vita activa aspect with their Sober October segment, where they try to challenge each other doing some kind of a bet where they have to work out the most. It's kind of complicated. In the comments, I can't see how the vita activa is playing a part, but I can see the vita contemplativa. And there are commenters equal, I would say about equal amounts, where you have some people trying to be mean and you have others striving for this vita contemplativa, this arete concept, where they are asserting or refuting claims with cited sources, scholarly journals, believe it or not, scholarly journals in the YouTube comments, religious texts, and news sources and data. So that would be an aspect of modernity. I consider that a Renaissance aspect of the comments. And then as far as modernity goes, you have empirical reasoning, you have objectivity, you're concerned about progress, asking questions, which means you need to embrace doubt. In the podcast, they do that all the time. Joe Rogan has people who know things that he doesn't, and they can cite studies to enhance claims or answer his questions. Also, if they think something is not correct, they'll use their engineer to fact check them right on the spot. In the comments, they're also embracing doubt, where people are not outwardly being mean to each other. You have them discussing a topic where it could be foreign policy in the US or the border issue in Mexico, and they're like, hey, I never thought of it that way. So it led me to a really complex conclusion. You know, are we in the Middle Ages of the internet? And I'd have to say yes and no, because we're seeing the medieval aspects and we're seeing the Renaissance aspects simultaneously. But we're not, I don't know if we're in any particular geist at the moment where we're regressing in time. I like to think that that's not happening based on the Renaissance elements that I'm seeing at play. And the whole world is participating in trying to figure out these ideas. So I like to think it's not medieval. I also don't know about the dialectic theory, how it comes into play here. I don't think, because Hegel kind of suggests that the seeds of destruction are planted as well as the seeds of a birth of particular geist. And I don't think things are picking up where others leave off here. I believe, because for instance, you can see this in humans. You know, we've had calculus for thousands of years, and yet babies are not born knowing algebra. We have to teach them. We have to teach them other stuff, and they have to become their own humans. And so I think because these theories are made by humans, they're going to take on what is said to be, where I'm considering to be intrinsically anthropogenic stages of development. They're going to grow up like humans, where they're going to have an inchoate stage, they're going to have an adolescence phase, which I believe we're in, right? People are striving for enlightenment, but they don't know how to make it happen, but they really want it to happen. And it wouldn't be a science experiment without, you know, having people try to develop the theory or disprove the theory. And so I think a lot of research needs to be done. There's a lot of different ways you can spin it. I really want to see somebody try to study Twitter anthropologically. I think that it's a big influencer as far as current events and how the geist will go. And those are my references. And if we have any Q&A, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. This was so interesting. I really enjoyed that kind of inner discussion of, we have had this promise of social networking, about humanity coming together, exchanging point of views and learning. And then we have that side where it has degenerated into name-calling, insults, where people are not really interested in learning, but are interested in taking their point of view. So I find it very, very interesting to see how you can analyze this kind of duality. We have a question here from John Ackerman. Why would human development be circular and not linear?
I don't know. I don't think it's circular either. I think it's fractal in a way. So like the way humans are, like we used to be a whole nother species, used to be an Australopithecus, right? But we're not continuing to be Australopithecus. We're kind of, everybody starts out young, they grow to be old, and they're going to have kids, and it's going to keep going, and they're going to go in their cycle. So I think it's something else. It's not a circle or linear. I think it's way more complicated than that. But like I said, I think it's more fractal. I also want to give a shout out to my sponsor, Stephen Fremming. He helped me a lot with developing my presentation. I don't know if he's in here, so.
He is right. Thank you, Dr. Fremming. That's why the comparison to the Middle Ages and not a new term? Was the, yeah, can you maybe talk about that? What was your inspiration for using?
Well, I think I tried to make a new term with that anthropogenic stages of development, and it ended up being really verbose. And no matter, so I'm not that creative to come up with a new concept, but I also think that even if you create a new concept, it's based off of things that have already happened, based off of aspects of the past. And I think the idea needs to be more developed with other people, not just my voice. So I don't want to be the one to label it as well.
So it sounds like it's a label that you chose because it was helpful, but there may be another label in the future that.
Absolutely, there may be another label. It was just it was the most succinct way to ask the question at the time.
Yes, and that's very important to figure out how can we operationalize a concept to actually ask a question. And sometimes those concepts are not, they're not finalized.